I got a haircut. Gene Wolfe's The Urth of the New Sun was published in 1987 and is his coda to his The Book of the New Sun series. When I finished The Book of the New Sun, I was finally relieved. I had a huge weight off my shoulders. Finally, I was rid of the responsibility of trudging through these weird, overly difficult, confusing, and esoteric books. But a month or so later, I started getting the nagging urge to return. It was like a toxic ex-lover. So yes, me and The Book of the New Sun got back together again. Even as I started turning the pages, I felt myself just smiling and being like, why did I do this to myself? This series is like your hometown sports team that always disappoints you in the playoff, but just that minuscule chance of seeing them win a championship is that potential high that's so tantalizing you can't turn away. All right, so what's going on in The Urth of the New Sun? This book takes place many years after the events of The Book of the New Sun. Remember how in The Book of the New Sun, Severian said that he was going to get judged off of Earth by some beings to see if he could bring the new sun back to Earth, therefore saving Earth. So yeah, that's the journey he's on right now. He's on this huge, massive ship, and it's like a city. It's really like a country. And in very typical Wolfe fashion, though, there's tons of people on board, but we're told nearly nothing about them. This is my favorite book in the series that I can say that I've read, and I think one of the big reasons is because this one, at least for a large portion of the book, feels a lot more sci-fi than other books in the series. One of my favorite things about The Book of the New Sun was that sort of archaic fantasy description of everyday things, or even like science fiction-y, traditional science fiction-y things. And with lots of this book being set outside of Earth, naturally there's a lot of that. Like, there's this super cool cyborg android character. There's these like necklaces that allow them to breathe in space, and so much more, all described with that typical Gene Wolfe brilliance. I've mentioned some of what's different, but for better or for worse, it still feels a lot like a Book of the New Sun book. It's definitely the most unique of the book, but it has got a lot in common still with the first four books. It's still written as Severian's writings. It's still got that sort of 14th century aesthetic, and it still has a fun mix of side characters that come in and out of the plot. And with these similarities, I think my main criticism of the books in the series remains the same as well, which is that I found the book so much more readable and so much more enjoyable when Severian had a direction. I really liked the first third of the book or so when Severian had a clear plan or a clear goal. Too often, especially after that first third of the book, it sort of devolves into Severian's musings, or just wandering, or doing really confusing shit, and just like talking to ethereal beings about theory, and it would just kind of get a little too head in the clouds for me. Maybe, and I'd even go as far as to say certainly, on a second read through, I would like these more confusing parts considerably more. But on my first read through, I was just desperately searching for that rope to guide me that I could hold on in the darkness of this plot. I didn't know a lot about The Book of the New Sun coming into the series, but I did know that there was a little bit of religious subtext to it, and honestly, in the first four books of the series, I didn't pick up on like any of it. But then this book came around. For the first time in the series, I noticed clear and pervasive subtext that paralleled characters and events in biblical stories. And I'm not like huge into God and Jesus and stuff, especially not Catholicism, but even with that and sort of an average-sized brain, I was able to pick up on a lot of these connections. And that was really, really fun. I won't spoil, obviously, specifically what the connections were, but to me, the payoff of linking the book's stories and characters with biblical ones was super rewarding as a reader. All right, now let me rapid fire a few things that I really disliked about this book. I hate time travel and I hate dreams or visions in media, and both of those showed up in spades in this book. If you're someone who likes those types of complexities, then by all means, eat your heart out. But for me, the sort of disorienting time travel complexities and the esoteric metaphors that we see in dreams just kind of made my eyes roll and me lose interest. And I think that's a super fair thing to consider coming into reading this book, because that's a considerable part of this book, is just sort of Gene Wolfe fleshing out the time travel undertones of this series. And while I'm talking about things that I disliked in this book, I need to mention one more, and it's a secret, so don't tell any other booktubers. I have no fucking clue what happened in the last 10 chapters of the book. Even more than the last 4 books, there were moments in this book that I was so lost. And I won't spoil exactly the things that made me confused, but I will say every time I heard the word Apupunchao, my eyes glazed over, my soul left my body, and I was deceased. The last 10 chapters or so were honestly nothing but a formality for me. Maybe that's bad to admit as someone who people watch for reviews, but I had this like sense of bewildered confusion that I would have had if I had walked into like a graduate level physics course at a local university. Gene Wolfe could have written that shit in Bulgarian. But yeah, enough about my potential inadequacies as a reviewer. Let's talk about the big payload of this book, which is the payoff. The most obvious draw to reading a long book series or watching a long TV series is that pipeline, in my opinion, from the initial setup to the eventual payoff of things down the line. And in my opinion, for the most part, this book really did deliver on that payoff. I discussed a fair bit in my The Book of the New Sun review that I think that Wolfe provided satisfying payoff to the series in the 4th novel. And there are absolutely more of those mind-bending, like aha moments in this book as well. This is definitely a big joy of the book, so I obviously won't spoil a lot of the big payoff or any of the payoff, but I did certainly have a lot of moments where I would read something and I'd be like, oh, I definitely want to go back to Shadow of the Torture and reread that section, or Cloud of the Conciliator, or whatever, because I knew that it would add a lot of meaning to it. Now, with this book being written a good few years after the initial Book of the New Sun was fully published, I found myself wondering, like, did I think that this was a result of what I'm going to call the Star Wars effect? Star Wars released in 1977, and with it came a ton of media, comics, books, eventually TV shows, and stuff like that. And these were used to sort of bolster the story-building world that Star Wars was creating. And a lot of what's done in those is it provides background stories to things that showed up in movies. Like, for example, let's say Glup Shido has a peg leg in one of the movies, and then a comic, like 30 years later, might go and explain why he has a peg leg, but when in reality, the reason that he did in the original movie was just because it looked cool. And so I sort of went into this book wondering if Gene Wolfe was trying to utilize that, Star Wars effect, making this Coda as a way to retroactively add meaning to the previous 4 books. Or did he have it in mind before he even started Shadow of the Torturer? And I'm obviously not him, but to the best of my understanding, this book was absolutely in his master plan from the very beginning. But I don't want to act like every single connection to an earlier book felt like a really satisfying payoff. A few times a character from one of the earlier books would come back into the plot, and sometimes it just felt like Wolfe was like jingling keys in front of a baby and being like, hey, remember this guy? Because I just would not understand the depth of the connection. Now, is that a me issue? Maybe. But that just goes back to sort of the thesis of a lot of my reviews for this series, which is it fair for authors to expect someone to reread the series in order to get the bulk of the payoff of the enjoyment of the series? So let me give you a pessimistic and an optimistic take about this book as the payoff to the series. Now here's my pessimistic take. Okay, so clearly Gene Wolfe had this book in mind before Shadow of the Torturer. But is it brilliant, as a lot of people say he is, just to tie things together throughout a couple of books? If I was cynical, I would say that it's not even that good. He just sets something up and then fills in a couple hundred pages with some stuff, and then he reflects back on it, and it's not that brilliant. It just feels really satisfying because he's filled in a couple hundred pages in between its introduction and its reemergence, and there's finally a payoff. I think too often people mistake like connecting a later thing with an earlier thing as brilliant payoff. And I think there's definitely a sense of sunk cost fallacy when people do that. Okay, let's be optimistic now. I will say I am absolutely not the most well-read reader in this space, and I'm absolutely not well-read at all in terms of long series because I usually don't read those types of books. And so maybe my criticism is not fair at all, and what I view with bias as drudgery is what a lot of people like in long fantasy series. In that case, I would say that this has got to be like the final boss of long interconnected fantasy books. Because, sure, it's got its slower parts, but it's got all the payoff. It's got the high stakes, it's got memorable characters, it's got crazy adventures, and it has all those in spades. So in a realistic sense, though, right, it's going to be somewhere in the middle, like everything. And the satisfaction of this book to readers is going to vary reader by reader. In my opinion, the critical point is that you want the stuff in the middle to be deepening the eventual payoff. And does Wolfe do that, in my opinion? Yes. No. I don't know. So I think to conclude, I'd like to talk about two questions that I had coming into the book. First, is this a book worth tacking on to your read of the Book of the New Sun? I would say absolutely. I think that love it or hate it, this book is absolutely the next step after reading The Citadel of the Autarch, in that it provides meaning to things in the series that otherwise would absolutely be lacking. And that also answers my second question, which is, do I see this as part of the Book of the New Sun? Well, I do think that it has the most difference between it and the other books in the series, mostly because of the setting of a lot of the book. To me, it is absolutely categorically part of the Book of the New Sun. So as I said at the beginning, going back to Wolfe feels a lot like returning to a toxic ex. Now, being done with it, I feel yet again very relieved to rid myself of the burden of Wolfe's complicated series. I definitely got a lot out of the series, but I'm excited to be finally done with it. So yeah, I'll see you at my Book of the Long Sun review. Thanks for watching.